Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a fundamental issue. Fresh water is the source of all forms of life on this planet. The protection and the preservation of fresh water are the issues of the 22nd century. Canada is one of the areas in the world that is the richest in water resources. However, our consumption of water is concentrated within a very specific geographic location. 60% of our waterways are in the north, whereas more than 90% of the consumption is along the border in the south. As stewards of 9% of the water, it is our moral obligation to preserve these resources for future generations. Thank God that this is an issue where there is a lot of consensus. For example, in the speech from the throne in 2008, on the 19th of November 2008, the government stated that in order to protect our precious resources, the government would bring forward legislative measures with a view to banning bulk water transports or exports from our hydrological basins, water basins.
Before, Mr. Speaker, I spoke of the speech from the throne in 2008 when I worked many years ago and as part of the previous government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. That was the last time that Canada took a comprehensive look at our water resources, and in a federal water policy that remains the only federal water policy passed to this date. In 1987, the Government of Canada committed to a federal water policy that included that we would ban bulk water exports. And yet we stand here more than 20 years later without that prohibition. Now, I am very grateful indeed to my friend for the introduction of the Bill C-267, which ascribes in every respect to the best possible approach to how to ban the transfer of bulk water from one basin to another. I'm aware, and I thank my friend from Bruce Grey Owen Sound for a similar bill, Bill C-383, and I would wish, had we the ability to do so, to blend the two. But there's no question that Bill C-267 responds to the issue in a way in which it must be responded. The Act respecting the preservation of Canada's water resources before us this evening deals with the issue in terms of the inter-basin transfer of water. There are 5 major drainage basins for all of the water of Canada. If you think of it, it's very logical, it's intuitive. All our water drains towards larger areas. So the 5 major drainage basins are, of course, the Arctic Ocean, Hudson Bay, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and even the Gulf of Mexico, from which our Great Lakes drain towards the south. These are the 5 major drainage basins, and it's to these drainage basins that Bill C-267 speaks by prohibiting the inter-basin transfer of water, prohibiting the massive transfer of water in bulk. This is critical because Bill C-383, which is quite similar to a previous government piece of legislation, which was then under the title of Bill C-26, dealt only with boundary and transboundary water. And I think it's important for us to remember that when we look at only boundary and transboundary water, we're looking at 10% of Canada's water resources. 90%, in other words, of Canada's water resources are found in basins that could not be defined as boundary or transboundary water. As such, the bill that we will be looking at later in this session, the International Boundary Waters Treaty and the International Rivers Improvement Act, is certainly laudable, but it falls far short of what we need, which is why, if it were possible to include the provisions of both bills together, we'd have stronger legislation. I don't have quite the same concern as the Honourable Member for Nickelback about the fact that it's left to regulations to describe a drainage basin. There's no question, however, that if we were, since there really are 5 drainage basins for Canada, they're well known, they're a matter of scientific fact, it certainly would be wise to include those when this bill goes to committee and comes to amendment, so that there's no wiggle room for some sort of political fix that would deny the hydrogeology rather, of Canada's landmass to try to say that there was something other than 5 major drainage basins. This is a scientific fact. It's what there is. We've always had the threat, when you look at the transfer of basin water from one to the other, the most grandiose of these schemes was put forward repeatedly in the early 80s, the Grand Canal scheme, with the idea that we would move water from one basin, from the Hudson Bay drainage basin, and put it into pipelines to ship it down to the U.S. That Grand Canal scheme would not be at all affected by Private Member's Bill C-383, which deals with boundary and transboundary water, but it would be completely caught by Bill C-267, which speaks to the key issue, which is the removal of water in bulk under the interpretation and definition section of this bill, quote, means the removal of water, whether it had been treated or not, from the major drainage basin in which the water is located by any means of diversion that includes, and they define pipeline, canal, tunnel, aqueduct, or channel. It's a perfect way of making sure the Grand Canal scheme never happens, or by any other means of diversion by which more than 50,000 liters of water per day is removed from the major drainage basin. This speaks to ecological realities. It's not a political statement of a boundary. It speaks to the key issue, which is how do we ensure that we don't commit a serious and egregious error in which Canada's water is moved from one basin to another. We think we're a water-rich nation, but the reality is that we only have 6% of the world. We have 9% of the world's renewable water. The U.S. has 6%. We're roughly in the same territory. For all the water we have, what we really have is precious, and we have to protect it. The other reason for this legislation, it doesn't come from an ecological threat. It comes from the reality of NAFTA. We have a situation where under the North American Free Trade Agreement, should we allow one single transaction of the shipment of water in bulk from one drainage basin to the other, and particularly from one drainage basin in Canada for sale in the United States, we would then have turned a tap on, which is simply impossible under the terms of NAFTA, to turn off. The reason one could say at this point that water isn't covered in NAFTA is that water in its natural state in natural water bodies and water courses is not a good in trade. The minute we make that a good in trade, then the taps are open everywhere. So it's critical that Canada protect our water sources by prohibiting the transfer of water in bulk, prohibiting its sale, prohibiting water in its natural state from ever being seen as a good in commerce. One last reason, Mr. Speaker, why this legislation is essential and why I'm so very proud to stand here as the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands and as the leader of the Green Party of Canada to speak, to plead that this House assembled live up to the commitments that were made in 1987 in the federal water policy, live up to the commitment of the current Prime Minister in the speech from the throne of 2008 to ban bulk water exports, and that is this. We may feel awash in water, but the impacts of the climate crisis, as a previous member has mentioned, will in fact have its primary initial impact on reducing our access to water in quality, reducing its quality and reducing its quantity. We need to take precautionary measures now. I plead with all members of this House to ensure that this bill, C-267, is the one that lives up to the promises of generations to protect our fresh water in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.